Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Carmen. You know, Josie, from your experiences as a 60s scoop survivor to today, a thriving community leader, there's a huge story in between of what God has done. So, Josie, if you take us back to your early years, you were born into a First Nations community and at 6 months old into the foster care system. But tell our viewers a little bit more about that early time in your life, what community you were in and all those different layers.
Yeah, so I'm a part of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, which is also known as the Sarnia Reserve for people that might be watching. I was born, my mother and father are both First Nations, and my mom's part of the Chippewas and Nawash, and that's where she was a member. I was born with them, and I always say they did the best they could to raise me with the skills and abilities that they had. But what I didn't know, and I wouldn't have known, is that they also had a lot of trauma from their own residential school experiences, from sexual abuse that had happened at Catholic churches and stuff. And so they weren't able to parent me. So I was put into the foster care system from a very, very young age, and went house to house, often not staying very long because there's not a lot of people that are willing or maybe even able to take a child in extra above their own family. And so I was part of that system for probably about 10 years. And I have some really bad stories from those times. I have some really bad abuses that happened. And some of the abuses I can't remember, but I know that they're there. But I also have seen God in those times as well. I did eventually get placed into my adoptive family, who is a Dutch family called the Vanderplugs. Mm-hmm. And they took me in because my mom was told that she couldn't have any children. Yeah. And so she adopted 3 First Nations children from across Canada. And so when she had us, all of a sudden she found out that she was pregnant. Mm-hmm. So we instantly had this beautiful Dutch family. And I've just seen so much of God in my life. Mm-hmm. When I came to the Vanderplugs, I didn't speak very often. Mm-hmm. And actually at school, I had what you call selective mutism. Mm. And selective mutism really is my little brain couldn't handle all of the abuse that I had been through, all the trauma I had been through, the disconnection from never having parents or consistent parents. So the only thing I could control was my voice. Yeah. And so I just stopped speaking. Mm-hmm. I understood what people were saying, but I just stopped speaking. And so when I started to live with the Vanderplugs, they started to get me some help from the school and from other people, and I was able to slowly regain my voice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so one of the things that the Vanderplugs really had taught me during that time was the power of prayer. Mm. And this is something that has been really vital in my life. And I just wanted to share one of the stories that had happened, which is a very big moment for me that I just wanted to share, is one time all of the water in our house was out, and I was about 9 years old. And my mom had 2 little babies, and she needed to get some formula, and the water wasn't working. Hadn't worked for a long time. And so my mom took my siblings, took them off to see my dad in the office, which was just on another part of the property, and I was left in the house by myself. And at that time, I was playing recorder, and it was a Zuki style, so you had the old school tape recorders with the lids that went up and down. And I remember just standing there thinking, I can't fix the water, I'm not a plumber, but I also don't like to see my mom looking sad. Yeah. And so I just stood there and I said to God, God, if you're real, I need you to turn on the water. So I prayed. And I said, when I put the lid down on this, because I had to give God something, when I put the lid down, if you could turn the water on, that would be great. And so I put my hand on the top of the lid. I pushed the lid recorder down, and all the water in the entire house came on. So God not only answered my prayer, but he showed me that anything is possible. He can give above and beyond what we ask for. Mm-hmm. And he does it with such power, grace and love, and that's always stuck with me.
Yes. Oh, Josie, such an inspiring story. And when God answers the prayer of a little girl like that and just moves in such a mighty way, there's such impact on your heart and your faith. You know, so for some of our viewers watching right now who might not know what the 60s Scoop was, it was between the 1960s and into the 1980s, where the Canadian government would come in and take kids from the homes of Indigenous families who were often struggling due to the residential school system. So all these layers, and yet God, and you had to go through so much as a result, but God brought you to such an interesting place. And so at 9 years old, I think, is that when the water came on, you have this encounter with God, and you just know he's real. Like, and this begins a journey for you where you have a lot of experiences with God. You begin to not only rediscover your voice, you begin to sing worship in a church. And yet your worship gets deemed a little too charismatic or outspoken. And that starts a spiral for you a bit where you pull back at times from God. Tell us a little bit more about the ups and downs of that journey that got you to today.
So one thing that I've always had the gifting to be able to hear God, which sounds really strange, but God's just given me this gift to be able to hear his voice, hear the Holy Spirit speak. And so when I started worshiping, I started hearing God say, I want you to take your music in this direction, or I want you to pray or sing this, or this is what's happening in the room. And so I remember just being obedient and going with that. And at that time, there were some people, they loved it. That's exactly where God was heading and taking them. But there were other people that was like, this is too much for the church right now. We just need you to stop. And so I ended up stopping. I ended up not actually even serving anymore for a very long time in worship. But God is so good and gracious, and he always was relentless in chasing me and bringing me back.
It's interesting, too, because, as you journeyed through life, you had 3 beautiful kids, and you also married a man who was, a non-believer, not following Jesus. And at a point, you start to really experience some challenges in the marriage as he has, starting to have some issues with his mental health and breakdown there. And you go back to a church and you think, well, they might judge me because my life's not looking so picture perfect or whatever we assume. But this church you go back to, it's a different church, but a church you knew. There's a whole other welcome from that pastor.
He instantly walked up to me. He said, I know who you are. I know what your gifting is. And we'd love to have you come back. And I took that as, okay, I'm back. Let's do this. And so I continued to lead worship there and do different ministry through music. And then, from that, I continued to do that for a very, very long time. But again, I just hadn't gotten any healing in my life. And so I started to fall away, and I started to kind of blame God for some of the things that had happened in my life.
Which is fair and understandable because you had suffered a lot at that age. If you look at the Psalms, there's so much truth about the human experience of suffering. At times David is shouting out saying, Lord, what is happening? And that makes sense to me. In 2019, though, you had another encounter with God where someone really spoke to you about using your gifts in music and ministry. And I think it was later in the day you had joined the Nawash House of Prayer. And it's an incredible ministry, and our viewers know of it because we've covered it quite a bit. But throughout the pandemic, you and your kids made a really neat declaration to God, and some incredible things have happened. Tell us a little bit about that. We'd love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. So through the pandemic, we just declared God as the head of our household. We basically said, God, you lead this household. I know that you'll provide for us. I know you'll supply all of our needs. And I also know that you'll bring us as a young family to the healing that we need as well. And so, it was just that opening. And I think God was just like, yes, thank you for the welcome. And he did what he did, and he's moved so mightily in my family. Both my younger kids came to the Lord over lunch, over tomato soup and grilled cheese. And we've been serving together in worship and in other capacities as well.
Well, Josie, I'm so thankful for you and for your life and the way you minister to those around you, including me. I'm so thankful you hear from God the way you do because it reaches so many of us. Josie, thank you for this wonderful conversation today and for this time together.
Thank you.